Okay, well, we're going to start with a recap of last week. Um, so, and then we'll sort of review last week in our breakout room. So you basically talk about what your practice last week and how you got on with it. And then we look at the constants in our experience. I told you last week that we would look at this week, so the constants of our experience. And then we'll have a tea break, and then we will look at the constants and karma in the second half. I might break that up slightly differently depending on the timing. So and then finally we look at our home practice. So I'll just share that. So last week we looked at we started with looking at the purpose of the course. So it was essentially the purpose of the course is to find a way of describing the mind from a Buddhist point of view, and we talked a lot about that, about finding ways to describe description tool for transforming the mind. And it's so everything in the course is aimed to be practical, although it can get a little abstract at times. And I presume at this stage you realise that the material from the course comes from this book called Mind and Harmony, which is sort of a companion book to a book called Know Your Mind, which again comes from this early Buddhist text called the Abhidharma. So then we looked at like they really if you want to sort of find a way of describing the mind, we need to watch the mind, we need to look at the mind. And so we looked at that, like Buddhism is a path, and by definition there's a sense of wanting or even needing to sort of make progress on that path. And so we start by taking sort of our practice deeper, and one of the ways we do that is by sort of looking at the mind and exploring the mind and how the mind works. And so we spent a bit of time last week actually looking at that. And so we looked at the sort of how we might watch the mind, and we looked at a text from the early Buddhists, a very early Buddhist text called the Dharmapada, which says that experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. And if one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. And experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows, like a shadow that never departs. So the fact is that mind is the basis of all our experience. That's what we were discussing last week. So mind is the basis of all our experience. And that doesn't mean that the external world is a mirage, rather that the situations we find ourselves in are the result of our behaviour. And that ultimately the source of our behaviour is our own mind. And we sort of discussed the fact that our mental states are of two kinds. They're pure and impure. So wholesome and unwholesome states of mind. We discussed these, the unwholesome or skillful and unskillful states of mind. So ones that came out of sort of ill will, craving ill will and cruelty, and non-ill will and non-cruelty. So the sort of kindness and mental states like that. And then we looked at what the mind might is. We did a couple of reflections, looking at our mind and what the mind might is. And we looked at the fact that the mind was transparent, it was knowing, and was momentary. And we did reflections around that. And then we looked at our homework for the week. So I asked you to go away for the week, for the last week, and reflect on some points. And one of them was that in your daily life, does it feel like that there are simply just two kinds of thought, this sort of wholesome and unwholesome thought, as the Buddha said? And if there isn't, can you simplify things so that you can see them in this way? Or is it a bit more nuanced than that? And secondly, what do you understand to be the difference between a positive and a negative mental state? And can you think of examples of how your mental states can have directly affected your experience of the world? So we asked you to reflect on that over the week. And the third one was, how does seeing the mind as each of the following affect your experience of yourself? So the mind is transparent, the cognition, and momentary. So it was to explore all the, well, not all of them, but to sort of reflect on at least some of this over the past week as you lived your life. So what we're going to do now is go into our breakout rooms, and we're going to spend 12 minutes, hopefully in the same groupings as we were in last week. It may not be quite possible. There were a couple of people who weren't here. There's at least one person that I can see who wasn't here last week, Emer. And welcome, Emer. And so we'll spend 12 minutes discussing how we got on with these. So basically, sort of how did you manage to do any of these reflections? What did you notice or learn about your mind from doing these reflections? And were there challenges that you sort of came up against in doing these? So yeah, so we sort of, did you manage to do it? Did you notice or learn anything about your mind? And what were the challenges that you come up against? Okay, when you're ready, Katie, you can start the breakout rooms. So enjoy the chat, and we'll see you in 12 minutes' time. So welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the chat and you found that useful going through the home practice. So let's fire ahead with the. If you have any questions, of course, during the morning, just fire them into chat, and I'll answer them as soon as I notice them. So yeah, let's go ahead with the topic for this morning, which are the constants. So I've been talking about this this work called the Abhidharma, this ancient Buddhist text called the Abhidharma, which describes our mind in the minutiae of our mind. So the Abhidharma describes a 51 mental events, with in total we're not going to go into all 51. You'll probably be thankful to hear in it because it keeps us here all day probably. But there are 5 mental states that are particularly different to the rest. And they're essential mental processes by which we perceive and respond to the world around us. And without them, there would be essentially no mind at all. And these are what we call the constants. And all 5 appear in each and every mind moment. So they're always there. And these are ethically neutral in themselves. So, like we've been talking about these, last week we were talking about the wholesome and unwholesome states of mind. So these constants can't be judged in and of themselves as either wholesome or unwholesome. They just are. They're constantly there, regardless of whether we're skillful or unskillful. And so we're not trying to sort of get rid of them, if you like, or we're not trying to transform them. We just use them in ways that are skillful or unskillful. And that leads, like the Dharmapada says, leads to our happiness or our unhappiness. And we'll see this, hopefully, in the course of the morning as we go through them. So we're breaking down a continuum here into discrete parts in a kind of an artificial way. So it's like looking at a rainbow, and like it's if each colour is vividly there. Now if you look at a rainbow, we can see that each colour, like we can't see the red and yellow and orange and blue as distinctly there. We like in reality, we can't see sharp boundaries between one colour and the next. It's blurred. So all the constants too blur into each other. But it's still useful to look at each one of them in turn. So I'm going to share my screen again while I go through this. Okay. So you can see the first one that I'm going to look at is called contact. As soon as I can get myself sorted here, we look at that. Okay. So contact provides the raw material of our experience. It's essentially the meeting of our sense faculties with an object. So we have these 5 physical sense faculties. So we have our eye, we have our ears, our nose, our tongue, and our tactile sense. So our sense of touch. And there's the mind sense too, that perceives mental objects. So any of you who are familiar with the Heart Sutra that we chant, where it talks about eye, ear, nose, tongue, body and mind. So Buddhism sees the mind as just another sense faculty, detecting memories, thoughts, etc. So collectively all 6 are called the 6 sense bases. Okay? And these are the bases of all our experience. So the BASIS, so the basis of all our experience. But ultimately we're dealing with mental events, not physical ones as such. If there was no consciousness, there would be no contact. It's a sort of example, if someone was asleep with eyes partially open and didn't notice light changing in a room, well, there would be no contact in that stage. In that case, at this stage, consciousness is very rudimentary. We know something is there, but not what it is yet. So that's contact. So the next one is feeling tone or Vedana. So the contact is Sparsa. So feeling tone is a crucial aspect of our mind's response to contact. It's very simple, really. It's the classification of contact as pleasant, painful, or neutral. So neutral feeling tone is neither pleasant nor painful. So when we automatically classify things in our experience as either painful, pleasant, or neutral. When there are pleasurable feeling tones, it's usually we have a desire for more of them. When there are painful feeling tones, we usually have a desire to get away from them. When there are neutral feeling tones, it's usually because we're not interested enough in what's really happening. So neutral feeling tones are not really the same as an absence of feeling tone. So it's just that we're not really interested in what's going on enough to go either way, wanting to sort of grab at it or wanting to push it away. So feeling tones arise in each of these 6 sense bases. So in the physical senses and in the mind. So there is a distinction between the physical and the mental feeling tone. Physical pleasure and pain, mental joy and sorrow. So there is a distinction here. So the physical has pleasure and pain, the mental has joy and sorrow. So physical feeling tone is a direct response to contact. So for example, we sort of food, sex, hunger, injury. So we have a response to that. We have a physical response to that. And mental feeling tone arises from our interpretation of that. So the joy of recognizing a loved one, or hearing a beautiful piece of music, for instance, or the sorrow of bereavement. So physical feeling tones are generally accompanied by a mental element, and mental feeling tones have a physical component to them. So there is some sort of crossover here. So the joy, again coming back to the same example, the joy of recognizing a loved one has a pleasant feeling tone of warmth, maybe in the heart area. The pleasure and pain are bound to the present moment, so that the joy and sorrow sort of are bound up with our perception of time, of memory, and of anticipation. So it's all bound up together. So the next one is interpretation or samya. So you're walking home, say, at night, and it's starting to get dark, say, and you see something brown scurrying along the ground, or maybe under a hedge, and that moves across your path. Your steps kind of falter, and you think it's a rat, but then you see it more clearly, and you see it's simply a large fallen leaf. So your feeling tone changes from an initial burst of fear and disgust to relief and maybe even aesthetic pleasure. So like that, most people's sort of reaction when they see a rat in the dark like that is fear. And then when you have this sense of relief, then when you realise that it's not a rat, it's simply a blown leaf, and there is a sense of of aesthetic pleasure when you in seeing something like that. So interpretation is where the mind makes sense of raw data of the contact. So our eye sees this thing scurrying across the ground as we think. And so we interpret that by relating it to past experience. So like we've seen a rat at some stage, so we interpret this movement in the dark as a rat. So the mind examines the information and recognizes it as something in particular. So firstly, you notice the object's basic characteristics. So it's brown and it's moving quite fast. So it has to be a rat, or at least that's what we think. Secondly, you search your store of memory for concepts which fit into those characteristics, and you give it the label. So you search rat. It's a rat. Sometimes the initial act of labeling is wrong, and then it may be corrected and a further sense data is collected. So we realize that, no, that's not quite moving in the same way a rat would. It's blowing around more. Oh, so it's not a rat. And we sort of reinterpret it. So interpretation gets much more complex too as we grow up, combining conceptual labels with other labels. So building conceptual structures that explain our existence to us in part or even in whole. So we can build these into systems of concepts and views, usually on the basis of ideas surrounding cultures that influence us. So religions, philosophies and worldviews, political views, these are all forms of interpretations. So these are all views that we take on, that the ways of interpreting the world. And usually we think of contact as the starting point for the constants. But it's worth pointing out that it'll sometimes that will is a better starting point for the constants. Take for the example the impulse to bite into a peach, say. There was contact, so this orangey red fragrant sphere. And then feeling tone, so a pleasant feeling tone related to this orangey red fragrant sphere. And then interpretation within our mind, a peach. But before contact, there was probably an impulse to investigate the fruit bowl. So our eye is taken towards the fruit bowl and we see the peach. So this impulse, this sort of impulse before the contact is will. So will is much more than a response to stimuli in the world. It's much more than a conscious desire. The world really doesn't flow in upon our passive senses. Rather, the mind throws itself into the world. So our mind is actually moving around, throwing itself into the world in a largely instinctive and unconscious way. So will is the energy that impels consciousness to seek out and involve itself in the world, and involve itself with objects around us. So being a constant, it never lets up. So the mind is always hungry, if you like. According to, we discussed last week that much of what we're talking about is based on a particular Buddhist school called the Yogacara. So according to the Yogacara, the mind is always hungry. It's always looking for objects to engage with. So this is will, Chaitana. So perhaps surprisingly to us, the mind's constant hunger is in itself morally neutral. So we're not doing that. This is happening. The mind is throwing itself out there. But it can be challenged, or channeled, should I say, in wholesome or unwholesome ways. And it can be challenged in sort of towards wholesome or unwholesome objects. So there is unwholesome craving, kama chandra, or wholesome desire. So dharma chandra, so desire for the truth. There's a positive aspect of this. So the next one, Manuscript Attention. So attention is the most elusive constant. And it's really the hardest one to talk about and the hardest one to define. It has two closely linked aspects. First, it corresponds to attention in the usual meaning of the English word. So the act of focusing our awareness on a particular object within a wider perceptual field. So paying attention to something in our experience. So I'm looking at the screen now. So I'm paying attention to what I can see of all you. Okay, so I'm paying attention to the screen. Or like, so for listening to an orchestra. And picking out the sound of the different instruments, say the cello or the clarinet, and giving your attention without losing touch with the rest of the orchestra. So you particularly like the clarinet or the cello, and you give your attention to that particular sound. So conditioned by will, our attention in this sense takes hold of this object rather than the whole. So it listens to the clarinet rather than the trumpet, because we find woodwind much more pleasant to listen to. So this is called the functional aspect of attention. So at a deeper level, it's the structure of the mind in general, something that brings together and welds the other four constants into a whole in each mind moment. And it's really where the functional aspect of the mind, so that what we see is the functional aspect of the mind, is really only the spirit tip, really. In each sort of confrontation, there is the perceived. So the music, we perceive the music, the concert hall, and the face of the clarinetist. On the other end is the perceiving. So you're sitting there listening, having responses of enjoyment, hopefully, if the music is good, or maybe bafflement of them if the music isn't sort of quite melodic, rejoicing in the music, in the musicians, or envying them even. So attention in its wider sense is the totality of the subject, the mind, attending to the object, what's out there. So it's about the whole existential situation, a way of talking about the mind moment as a whole, both subject and object. So these are the constants. These are there in our experience constantly, and as I said, they are ethically neutral. So they're not wholesome and they're not unwholesome in and of themselves. But what we can do with them we can make them wholesome or unwholesome. So let's do an exercise now. So just where you are, just closing your eyes. So what do you feel in contact with? So what's impinging upon your physical senses? Remember the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. And can you distinguish between these physical sense impressions that are pleasant and the ones that are painful? And if your experience is more neutral, what's actually happening? And if you're noticing mental sense impressions, are they tinged with joy or with sorrow? What are your actual feeling tones? Notice how you recognize things as they happen. For example, recognizing that a car is going past. People's voices. Noticing your emotional response to these things. Are you attracted to them? Do you want more of them? Do you want to be involved in that conversation maybe? Are you repulsed by them? Do you want them to be gone from your experience, like the interruptive sound of the car? Do you want it gone? Maybe noticing how your awareness moves around and just picks out specific things out of the overall mix of your experience. We can't be constantly aware of everything. The mind tends to settle on certain things for a time and then moves on. Can you see this happening in your experience right now? And in this mix of input and sense impressions, can you be aware of yourself in all this? So the fullness of your experience, the deeper aspect of attention. So for the next 5 minutes or so, just keep watching, keep noticing the physical sense impressions, the mental sense impressions, the feeling tones, the pleasant, the painful, the neutral, our emotional responses to these things, how we are attracted, repulsed. Then do we have a sense of ourselves in all this, the fullness of our experience at the same time? So maybe you might like to share in chat how that was. Things you might have noticed, if anything. Or questions you might have had around it. So what did you notice while we were doing that? Yeah, Tom, the mind does move around, definitely. In what way does it move around? Did anybody notice? Did it move around in a pattern? Was there a pattern to what? The way your mind moved around? So either you want to judge and to fix your feelings. In what way did that you were trying to get away from either the pleasant or the unpleasant sensation? And I wonder, anybody have any idea why we do that? So Lazarus, you're saying that your mind went back to something you talked about in Breakout, and to a text message you received before the meeting in a sort of positive, did it have a positive or a negative sort of aspect to it? Was it sort of, a pleasant or an unpleasant sense impression? Alexander, you had this idea of concerned. Okay, Lazarus. Okay, interesting. Yeah, if maybe there was just, you were saying it was like it felt tiring watching your mind move around very fast, skipping the thoughts. We were trying to sort of focus too hard rather than just have a broad sort of sense impression of what was going on. No, Alexander, you're saying that do the constants follow a certain order, or do they exist at the same time? Like I was saying, like the rainbow, they tend to exist at the same time. So there's no, like, obviously they blur into one another. So they do tend to exist at the same time, and not in the order that I presented them. They, like, contact, like as I said, contact can be the first impression we get, but like so can will. Like I was saying with will, our mind can throw itself out there and come across, like the example with the peach. It can throw itself out there and suddenly light on the fruit bowl, and it can move on from will rather than sort of contact. So the will of the mind throwing itself out there is the initial sort of factor in it. So it's not always the like sort of contact, which is the first one on the list. Like so. And then you talk about the. I think in that example, as I mentioned about the hedge at night and the interpretation. I think you do always feel fear. Yeah, like it depends on our, like, if we like rats, we don't. It depends on our process. Most people do have a fear of rats, or like at least a sort of a wariness around rats. But that it's generally, if you think there's a rat in like, and the way it moves in the dark and that, when like we do tend to sort of at least have a wariness, if not fear, to what we think is there. So yeah, like it's like Lindsay was saying, like, this feeling, the sort of warmth on your face, as you're sitting there, and just like sometimes it's just sort of appreciating what's there in our experience, and then it suddenly comes up, like we're having a really pleasant experience, but then to realizing that, ooh, we're hungry, and we say, I want food, like, so the craving comes in then. So it's like, we're having this really pleasant sort of contented experience, and then the craving comes in out of nowhere, like, so it is really, our experience is really complex, like, That's an interesting one, Lazarus. Like, I've consciously imagined what it would be experiencing if all your concerns were resolved and you had no issues with anything, and that was expansively peaceful. Yeah, it was just like that. That is like, that's, yeah, if we could just sort of let go of our concerns, that is what we would experience, is this peacefulness, like, That's interesting, Cara, that it's always from will, and to be able to see that actually is quite sort of enlightening, to see your triggers, and because that's where we begin to learn about our mind. That's where we begin to be able to work with our mind, when we see our triggers. That's what this is really getting at, is being able to see our triggers. What, like, so, like the rat example, getting back to that thing, sort of seeing the scurrying in the dark, and not immediately going for a trigger. That's a rat, I'm getting scared. Being able to sort of, in a sense, step back mentally and say, like, before we react with the fear, just see, well, don't get into the interpretation first. You just say, okay, maybe it's not, like, so that's interesting. Like, now it's being able to work with it, so we can see our triggers, are sort of, and they are more thought related. I think that, and all our triggers are more thought related than anything else, like, So I think it's it's 20 to 12 now, so I think we need a break. I just read Isabel's one. Overall, it felt at peace, but two sensory limitations came over me. One was your wrought iron chair, so it's the physical, like, the physical, I presume, physical sort of discomfort, and cold on your back, and that's like, and then the second, I could hear a radio in another room, which is distracting. Yeah, that's it. That's interesting. Like, we have this sort of sense of peace, but then there's something else sort of taking us away from that. And that's why we tend to try and sort of not be sort of like those things are in our experiences, and it's not to be drawn away by them, and not to try and push them away there, because they are there. And if we try and push them away, what actually happens is that we're actually drawn more towards them. If we just let them be there in our experience, they are just there. But it's when we try and push them away, it's like with anything, if we try and push something away, we get more involved in it. We just let them be there, they're just there. So we take a break. It's 11:41 now. So if we come back at 11:51, so stretch your legs. If you can get a cup of tea, drink of water or whatever. So we'll see you back here at 11:51. I just want. Sorry, Katie. I just wanted to say something about the course, and like I said last week, the course is of course free, and I don't want to sort of. I do want to emphasize that the course is free, but we are dependent on donations from people, and the reason that we've been able to keep going. This is probably one of the last fully online courses that we will do. We are back in the centre, and I think courses from now on will probably be hybrid, like to be online and face to face. But we are still dependent on donations from people. We probably will go forward with this system of not charging for courses and just being dependent on people's generosity. So I'm just appealing to your generosity. On the course is free. We are dependent on donations. So if you haven't, or if you have, I want to sort of thank you if you have made a donation, and if you haven't, I would sort of ask you if you could please make a donation. If you can't, that's fine. The course is of course free. Katie has put a slide up there with the details on it, and Katie has put it into chat. We're very grateful for any donations we can receive. That's that's why we're still going after 2 years of a pandemic, because of people's generosity, and we're really, really grateful for it. So that's yeah. And it's basically what we base it on is on the basis of take what you need, give what you can, and that's the whole basis of this. It's based on the Buddhist principle of generosity. Dana. Okay. So what I want to talk about now are the constants and karma. So to grasp the full significance of the constants for our practice of Buddhism, or you might say our spiritual life, whatever our spiritual life is, whatever shape that has, we need to understand the role that each one of them plays in the workings of karma, or the how we relate to each one of them, really. And I know you've had a lot of information today. It can be very abstract, this material. So I'll try and keep it as simple as I can, but it is abstract material. That's why the notes are important. It's important to read the notes during the week that come with the email. So yeah. I think it's important to sort of clear up. There are many misconceptions out there about what karma is. So I need to define my terms, if you like, about what karma is, and to sort of remind you what karma is in Buddhist terms. It's not some mysterious power standing over us, which is sometimes how it's seen. watching us unblinkingly, if you like, devising a punishment to fit each crime, and apt to sort of reward every good deed and punish every bad deed. Karma is both much simpler and much more profound than that. It is, in a way, it is what we shape our future with by shaping our mind. That's essentially what karma is. And it's like sometimes it's seen as an all-inclusive causal system. Some people believe that everything that befalls us is as the result of karma. That's not quite true. Whether like all good or all ill that befalls us, you'll hear people like tell you, oh, that's karma, or karma's going to get you, or blah blah blah, or he'll get his karma, or whatever. I'm sure there are lots of people saying it about sort of Vladimir Putin at the moment and many other individuals, like, but karma does play a part in all this, in what happens in the future. But there are laws of nature, which that's why I like. If you have the book, read the book on this. It's really interesting stuff. There's something called the niyamas, which I don't have time. The 5 niyamas, which makes karma much more nuanced. It explains it in a much more nuanced way than its pure cause and effect. But yeah. So there are 2 aspects we really need to look at. So we act, and those actions have a fruit in the future. Basically, that's what. And we can see that, I think, in ourselves, like, that in our own experience. In each moment, we experience the fruits of our actions, whatever that is, in quite simple ways and quite complex ways. So karma means karma. The word itself, karma, simply means action. It's nothing more complicated than that. Karma simply means action, and usually refers to this cause process, that which sets things in motion. So this is called karma creation. So like we get into a grumpy mood, say for instance, and there's an action that we ourselves do. But there's also a fruit which comes down the line from that action. So this is called the karma result. So there's the karma creation, we get in the grumpy mood. The karma result is the fruit that comes of that. So for example, we get in a grumpy mood and we find that the fruit of this is the world seems a bit more unpleasant for us. Or we essentially make our world a bit more unpleasant. And if we continue to sort of live in that unpleasant world, well, people avoid us. So we experience the fruit of our grumpiness, and the fruit being the unpleasantness we experience. So that's one sort of explanation, or one example of the karmic effect. And looking at the constants, the contact and feeling tone are the results of previous things that we've done. So contact is a karma result. What we experience now is a result of choices that we have made in the past. And we can make new choices now in order to set a course for a different future. Just the whole point in the Buddhist path is that the choices we make to decide our future, decide our life. We have choice. We have a choice in the life that we lead, the life that we have. So when we make new choices, the new choices now in order to set a course for a different future. But in the here and now, what we experience is what we're stuck with, which, like, you know, because this is the result of choices that we've made in the past. So in the immediate time here and now, we're sort of working with choices that we've made in the past. But that doesn't mean that we're stuck with them, that we're fixed, that this is fixed. We do have choices to set up something different for tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Feeling tone is also a karma result. We have no power to choose a feeling tone in the present moment. So contact impinges on us now as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, depending on our choices in the past. So, like, say, for example, a punch in the nose is unpleasant. Our favourite football team, rugby team, whatever, that we've heavily invested in, and people tend to heavily invest in things like this, is being beaten, and this causes us sorrow. So that is a karmic result. Of course, future feeling tone can be modified by our present choices. So we don't heavily invest in this sort of football team. I know this is something, I'm sort of a rugby fan, and I still follow Leinster Rugby Football Club, but, like, if they lost, I'm not going to get into sort of bad mood, get grumpy because they lose, but I used to. It would affect my day. And I had this colleague when I worked in UCD who you couldn't talk to for 2 days when Manchester United were beaten. And that's the way we get invested in things. But I did the same thing with Leinster, not quite as bad as this colleague of mine. Of course, future feeling tone can be modified by our present choices, as I say. Not just in the distant future either. As soon as we experience a feeling tone, we can mindfully work with it. That is the beauty of this, that as soon as we experience this feeling tone, we can mindfully work with it, influencing the way it develops. So we can sort of, if you like, short circuit the system, if you like, and we can modify our attitude, so other feeling tones in the immediate future are less unpleasant. So we can lessen our attachment to this particular football team winning right from when we feel this sort of sorrow for them losing. So we feel the initial sorrow and we can let go of that quite sort of right in the immediate future. Will is our emotional and volitional response to contact and feeling tone. So will is what we do. Will is the domain of choice, and it is a karma creation. So contact and feeling tone will strongly predispose will to respond in certain ways. But they don't finally determine it. So, for an example, we can, despite strong habits, and we all have strong habits, resist the impulse to distract ourselves from boredom by embarking on a greedy quest for pleasure. So we don't have to do this. We all, left to our own devices, sometimes we get bored. And often our reaction to boredom is to look for something to fill that gap. So there's a gap, and we don't like boredom. We find boredom unpleasant, and we want to fill it. And usually, what we want to fill it with is something pleasant, which is usually some sort of pleasure. So, but we don't have to do that. We can resist this impulse to distract ourselves from the boredom by embarking on this greedy impulse for pleasure. So we can sort of, if you like, short circuit this system. So what I want to talk about now is wise and unwise attention. So attention has both functional and existential aspects, as we've seen. But I'm going to focus on the aspect which is where we choose to bring our attention to this thing rather than to that thing, such as the clarinetist in the orchestra that I talked about earlier on. And this is strongly directed by our will. So we choose to eat the peach, and then it's natural that we give it attention, savouring it as we eat it. So to engage with a particular object emotionally by liking it or by loathing it, depending on the object, is to focus our attention on it. So this aspect of our attention seems to be strongly tied up with our will. We exercise some choice about what we pay attention to and how we pay attention to it. So we're relaxing after a hard day's work, for instance, and our boss calls us and tells us to do some urgent extra work from home. So we may focus on our frustration and get into deeply negative mental states. Or we might, for instance, skillfully question the boss or as to whether the work is really that urgent and if it can't wait until tomorrow. If it is urgent, we could do it calmly and, if not, explain firmly but pleasantly that we'll do it tomorrow. So you then enjoy your night off. So any object has a number of features. So we have these choices, like we could get into sort of this sort of sense of frustration and deeply negative mental states around being called after work and asked to do extra work. And this can happen particularly, there's still a lot of people working from home, and I think this can happen particularly at the moment with people working from home. So we could get into this sense of frustration and deeply negative states, or we can act skillfully and question our boss and say, like, is this really that urgent? Can't it wait until tomorrow morning? Like, I start really early. Can it not wait till then? So, and if it is like urgent, like if he says it is urgent, well, we can do it calmly. And but if it isn't, you can say, like, firmly, because we have choices in these things. Like, they're bosses, they're not sort of, they don't rule our lives. Like, we can explain firmly but pleasantly that we'll do it tomorrow and then enjoy our night off. So it's in a way a set of choices at the mental level paves the way for either skillful or unskillful action at the level of speech and body, if you see what I mean. So there's an element of choice here. So this is where the karmic creation comes in at this level. So this is drawn out into the distinction between wise and unwise attention. Wise attention is the kind that keeps the mind in harmony with reality and leads to happiness. So, like, reality being the way things are, especially seeing things as permanent, as having substantial existence. Of course, things, according to the Buddha's teaching, things are impermanent, things change, things are in constant flow and flux. Nothing is permanent. Things are sort of dependent on conditions. Everything is dependent on conditions, but if we see, especially seeing things independent of conditions, or as offering lasting satisfaction, nothing, according to the Buddha, offers lasting satisfaction. And if you think about this, you will see that nothing can inherently offer lasting satisfaction. And all of these they do not none of these have can offer any of this. So wise attention recognizes directly that each thing that arises in our experience is momentary. So everything that comes into our mind is momentary. It's empty of any substance and can grant no more than a fleeting pleasure or happiness. And the problem with it is that we grasp onto things and hold on to things tightly as if they did, like they last forever. Nothing lasts forever. Like the few flowers in the vase behind me, they will be gone in a few days. Everything passes on. So this could, I suppose, be called thorough attention. And unwise attention falsifies things. It presents us with an object that is partially, even mostly unreal, born out of our own craving or ill will. So the reason I want to those flowers to last forever is because they bring me pleasure. And because something brings me pleasure, or like I want a relationship to last forever, because I crave that particular person. But unfortunately, relationships don't last forever because we don't last forever, and people move on for whatever reason. And there's a poem by William Blake that talks about kissing the joy as it flies. Brings us into eternity. I'm paraphrasing it, I can't remember exactly. Brings us into eternity's sunrise. And that's the thing with this, the wise attention is about kissing the joy as it flies and living in eternity's sunrise. Whereas the unwise attention holds us, like trying to hold on to stuff tightly that is fleeting. It's like trying to hold on to a cloud, if you like, that we can't hold on to. Everything is like a cloud. So unwise attention falsifies things. It presents us with this object that's partially or even mostly unreal, like the cloud. It's like everything is like that, born out of our own craving or ill will. So this could even be called careless attention. So let's look at shallow and deep interpretation. So a lot of interpretation is, like feeling tone, an automatic response or product of prior conditioning. So like if we go back to the rat situation again, that's usually down to conditioning. My mother made me absolutely scared of rats. She was scared of rats herself. She couldn't see a rodent, even a tiny mouse even, on a TV screen. But she would have to turn away, and so I have this morbid fear of rats that's come from her. So that is like a this is my prior conditioning towards rodents, so it simply assigns conventional labels to items that comprise or compromise our shared world, if you like. So we can't choose to perceive a peach as, say, a tennis ball. It's not. A peach is not a tennis ball. It is a peach. In as much as it belongs to the sphere of karma at all, this sort of karma is karma result. Okay? So granted, we can make mistakes such as with the rat and the leaf. but we quickly correct ourselves at this level. So we suddenly realise, no, that's not a rat, that's a leaf, and we correct ourselves. However, labelling, so as Carol was saying earlier on, we recognise our triggers quite quickly, and we realise, no, that's not a rat, that's a leaf. So we don't fall into the fear factor, my fear factor around rats. However, labelling of more subtle and complex objects, such as mental states, can involve more significant errors. So your boss again calls you at home. You might automatically label his voice as angry or condescending, and even though he might be just agitated about the situation, like he's been landed with this stuff into his lap, and it's got nothing to do with you, and we react to that. But the complexities of an interpretation don't end there. They can be shallow or deep interpretation. So the mind is often called upon to do a complex, even creative role in producing an adequate picture of the object that confronts it. So you answer the front door, say for instance, to find a homeless woman there who you have given money to a few times before, say, on the street, and she's dishevelled and has paint on her face with a similar coloured paint covered cloth in her hand, say for instance. So your interpretation kicks in and you recognise that she's been spraying solvent onto the rag and inhaling them. So we have a view around that. Other impressions arise of someone deeply besmirched, her human dignity, and disapproving recognition of how she has spent the money that you gave her to buy solvent, to buy paint, to inhale. So we have all this stuff going on. Also a recognition that she might get paint as she lurches around on your property. So we've all this stuff. But the other sense information arises in a sense of memories. Have you heard that people in her situation can often after been inhaling solvents since childhood, no doubt as a result of neglect, abuse, and anyone who has been through her conditions might end up here where she is. But you might alternatively continue to interpret her situation in a much less generous way and slam the door in her face, but you might not. You can choose to give her food and tea, and then she wanders away again, and you feel somewhat better for not having slammed the door in her face. But you have a choice about which way you go, what interpretation you make. At this level, interpretation ceases to merely be a karma result and starts to be a karma creation. When presented with a complex object, so the woman on the doorstep, the mind frequently does a series of takes, each with its own implications of action. So they may vary so widely that before we can choose an action, we must in a sense choose what object to perceive. So we take a okay, she's inhaling paint, she's inherently bad, or she's inhaling this because of what's gone on in the past. She's been at this since she was a kid, and she's only started that because of all complex issues. Our first interpretation of a complex situation, our first acts of interpretation, are likely to spring from our most basic habits and habitual ways of seeing the world. This is what happens. They come from our basic habits and ways of seeing the world. And this is shallow interpretation and not really the best way of acting. But if we don't follow our initial thoughts or too impetuously, even succeeding mind moments may deepen interpretation, bringing more subtle and more complex associations into play, which will modify our initial interpretations of the situation. So our interpretations deepen, and we can choose a more thoughtful and more creative response rather than simply reacting habitually. So we don't slam the door in the homeless woman's face. So this is like, there's a lot there, there's a lot to think about in those, like, there's been a quite short space of time with this. So I would suggest that if you have the book, there's an awful lot more in the book, Subhuti's book. I would suggest if you have the book, read it, study it actually. There's more in the notes as well. So read the notes over the week. I only have so much time where I can sort of get this, try and get this stuff across to you. So yeah, do read the notes, do sort of read the book if you have it, study the book if you have it. It does make a difference. So like, you know, the difference, this is only an example, it's kind of an extreme example of the homeless woman at the door. Like the difference between slamming the door in her face and reacting creatively by sort of either giving her money or giving her some food. And the effect that has on our own sort of consciousness. Well, let's just see what Carol has put into chat. Carol always comes up with good stuff. It's why Buddhist monks tend to take their time to answer a question, because they're going deeper. Yeah, exactly. A more subtle interpretation of the situation. That's a very good point, Carol. It's why we should actually take time, all of us, not just Buddhist monks, why we should all take time and consider, when we can, consider any situation, so we can interpret it properly and not with our sort of just through our sort of conditioned responses. So what I want to do now is just go through the homework for the week. So I'm going to share screen again. No, I'm not asking you for money again, that's just the last slide. So this is quite wordy, so let me just interpret it for you. I'm just putting it up there so you can see it. I'm not expecting you to read it. So what I want you to do is reflect, and all this will be in the email that comes to you. So we're going to reflect on some or all of the following sort of questions. So make a point of pausing a few times each day to investigate what pleasant or pleasurable or painful feeling tones you're experiencing during the day. Because we will experience this constantly throughout the day. So take time, make a point of pausing a few times each day to investigate the pleasurable or painful feeling tones that you're experiencing. And notice if they immediately turn into likes and dislikes, because that's how we get our likes and dislikes. So they sort of, we start off, our sort of like for chocolate starts off with the pleasurable feeling tone that we get from eating chocolate, and lots of other things as well. Can you notice any gap between the feeling tone and the dependently arising emotion, i.e. will? So everything arises depending on something else. So can you see the connection between the feeling tone and the emotion that comes up after that? So secondly, try looking around at the objects of your perception without labelling them. So for instance, taking in a chair, or more importantly, I think, a person, without getting caught up in labels about them. So, for instance, the homeless woman at the door, without trying not to get caught up in the labels about them, or like the homeless woman at the door is probably not the best example, but the person on the street that we see, and we do it all the time. We get caught up and put labels on them. And what difference, if any, does it make to the quality of your experience if you do this? Is taking in the object or the person without getting caught up in the labels that we put on them immediately. So just seeing can you sort of see that as you go through your week. So thirdly, will is the energy that impels consciousness to seek out and involve itself with objects. Do you see this happening in your daily experience as a constant? So that it's constantly there. Can you practice watching how will shapes your world, how your mind throws itself out into the world, and how that shapes the world that you inhabit? Whoop, I would accidentally, apologies for that. I managed to stop screen sharing. So you should be able to see the last one then. Do you see how attention is constantly taking hold of things and then holding on to them and then leaving hold of objects of experience? So just final notes about the whole home practice idea before we finish. Of course, you're not going to be able to do everything, and don't even try to do everything unless you have a lot of time. Just simply just reading the notes, you will get something out of doing the course. And certainly don't feel like that you have to try and do it all. As I say, unless you've got a lot of time in your hands, and most of us don't have all that time on our hands. And you may simply use those questions that I put to you as sort of reflections, like a sort of topics for reflection. You may spend some time in meditation reflecting on what you've done too. There are suggestions in the homework. But try and do at least 10 minutes a day on those topics that I've suggested. And just decide maybe how you're going to do this, how you're going to get this 10 minutes. And if you do have a meditation practice, continue meditating, because meditation is how we actually start to sort of interpret the workings of our mind, and try and sort of encourage your meditation practice. Okay, that's it, unless there are any questions. And next week we look at what are called the intensifiers, which is what we experience how we experience our mind when we get absorbed, particularly in meditation, but not just in meditation. We can get absorbed in other ways too.